All right. Nice to have so many people here for the last talk already on the Dev Days. So give a big applause to Benni Mack. Well, I hope you hear me. Yeah. We'll see if you. I don't know. We'll see if you applaud later. So this talk's different to, you've probably seen everything, a lot of things before. This one is different than the things I did on the previous ones. Just you already know me. Just if you haven't seen any talks of mine at the Developer Days, that's me. I work at a company called v10. I do a lot of TYPO3 stuff, but I also I'm part of this PSR-14 working group, and that's why I'm here today, and not because I'm somebody else or in somebody else's role. And the talk will be split in two parts, and the one part is about telling you about all these PSR things and what that is and how I got involved in that. And the second part will be a bit quicker and more demo on how we can use this PSR-14 stuff in TYPO3. Because the PSR-14 stuff changed from my initial idea on how to get it in TYPO3. Anyway, so what's this PHP-FIG? There's a website, PHP-FIG, and basically at some conference, some PHP conference, people sat together and said, we should solve the issues we all solve. We should find a common standard because we all solve it a bit different, but we always have the same issues in PHP. And in PHP, which is, TYPO3 is like a small part of the whole PHP community. And in PHP, usually it's like, well, they have to fix it in core. And so everybody's basically blaming the PHP core developers, or not blaming, but just are lazy enough to say, well, you should come up with something in PHP. And PHP core developers didn't do that. So at a conference in 2009, they set together a couple of people, and that's when the PHP-FIG started. And it stands for Framework Interoperability Group. Don't know that. And somehow there were a lot of people, and if you have a lot of people with strong opinions, there's a lot of heat and fighting. So they have that because they have a strong opinion on coding. And they started with so-called greater interoperability. And the idea is that if you look at one PHP project or library or framework or CMS, you can look at the other and it feels similar because the concepts are similar. Not the concepts in the way the framework is built, but more, the coding guidelines are similar. So these PSRs, they started with PSR-1 and PSR-2, and PSR-2 is the next level of PSR-1, and that's just about coding standards. Well, we'll use spaces versus tabs, and there's an endless discussion on the internet about what's better since decades if you want to use spaces or tabs. So you have to find just one, you have to take a decision. That's what the PHP-FIG did with PSR-1, and then they had some improvements, and that was PSR-2. And PSR-12 is now in the making, which is another coding standard guideline. And if you have the standard, you can write a lot of these, clean up my code to make it similar, or like to follow all these guidelines, which is nice. And we're using that in TYPO3 since version 7. So no code in TYPO3 is in TYPO3 that it's not PSR2 compatible. No PHP code. Some HTML stuff is not covered by that. Anyway, so this loose group of people, they were like, oh, the gurus, right? They came up with these great ideas. And basically, these are just regular guys and girls. And anyways, they had some issues about like what's the structure and all these, who's allowed to vote. So it's actually a standard and it's set in stone. So they had some iterations on this group because it's just like anybody can say something and say that's crap or not. So in 2000, I think I wanted to help out and actually tell them, hey, we're at TYPO3, we're doing some stuff with this PHP-FIG. Maybe we can collaborate. And at that time, Carsten from the Neos team was already part of that group. I did not know that. And represented TYPO3, but then he represented Neos. And then somehow TYPO3 is not a project of, or a project partner, project representative in the PHP-FIG, because there was always this discussion, well, when is a project, is a framework a project, or is it actually a CMS, or PHP-BB? If you know PHP-BB, that's the great forum. It's still successful. And that's also part of it, because this dude was there in the beginning. We also have, well, anyways, somehow there was a lot of discussion, and then they came up with a nice idea, which I think is quite cool. So you have these projects, they basically say, we're supporting this PHP-FIG thing, and all the standard, or not all the standards, but like we like what they're doing, and we think it's important. So that's like a member project. So you can become a member if you're a known PHP project. Then there's a group of 12 people. That's called the core committee. And they're basically trying to find out if there's something that could be a common denominator, something that could evolve into a PSR. And these 12 people are people. They don't have to be in any member project. If you want to become a core committee member, you just raise your hand at the right time, because then you're voted, and then you're in for 2 years, and then you have to get a revote. And then we have secretaries, 2 of them, and they're basically doing the ugly work, which is communication for us developers. So they write every 2 months a blog post, what happened. They make sure that these votes for such a PSR is correct, and well, they just manage these kind of things. Yeah, and of course, if you've ever done anything with TYPO3, you've heard of PSRs. So the PSR1 and 2 are nice. PSR3 is monologue. It's not really monologue, but it's a logging API. So we've talked about PSR1 and 2, which is like you have to, and these recommendations are written like a set in stone. You must not use tabs or spaces. You should do this and that. Your line ending should not be longer than 74 characters or something like that. And then there's like this PSR document, and then there's the explanation why this working group that came up with the standard decided on which direction. And PSR3 is PSR that comes up with, that has a set of interfaces in PHP, so you can actually just require the composer package and use these interfaces. And if everybody's using this interface, then you can, interface is there, so you can just say, I need this interface, and it does not matter if it's from Monolog or some other tool. that's really great for logging. So the PSR-3 basically has a log level interface defining some constants and a logger interface. And in TYPO3, we've also used this logger aware trait, and these kind of things come from PSR-3. However, we also had a log level class in TYPO3, and that was created similar to PSR-3, but it was different because we had a log level, and log level is like emergency, notice, debug, and error. And the log level error, in our case, had the number 7 because it was conforming to some RFC standard, whatever. And the log level in PSR-3 has emergency equals emergency. So it's a string. So we're not compatible. Nobody's noticing that, but we can't interchange this. And why do we have to create this own interface if there's one already? That's the reason why we couldn't implement monologue, because the monologue expects a string, and we have numbers. So with version 10, for instance, we had a minor change in this lower level API for us, that we got rid of our stuff, and it's breaking. But now we have PSR-3, and that's when we could use monologue, because with monologue you can log to Slack, you can log to whatever tool you want to use, log to a queue, and it's all built in, and we don't have to write this ourselves because it's already there. So that's nice. PSR-3 is funny because Jordi, the inventor of monologue, he was part of the PSR-3, and monologue was the only implementation there. So it's basically PSR-3 is monologue. So nobody else wanted, because it's so feature complete, nobody else wanted to add something. And monologue is basic, so it's a logging. So why do everybody has to create their own logging stuff? Maintain it. PSR-0 and 4 are auto-loading things, like we have a classes folder and we just put the name and the namespace in the right order, and that's how actually Composer got started, or not got started, but got powerful. And then we have a lot of these PSR-7, 15, 17, and 18. This is all this HTTP request response stuff. Cool thing is, we did not have this request response stuff in TYPO3 at all. We just used general utility, GP, give me the get parameter, the post parameter here. We'll figure out something with cookies. We're still doing cookies the ugly way, or the global way. And PSR-7 is just mapping everything on requests and not having to deal with super globals in PHP. And that allows to do a lot of cool things with that. And I like that idea, but it's the opposite side of what Symfony does. Symfony has, so I'm always talking about, hey, well, we're going to implement more Symfony stuff. We're going to do more PSR stuff. That's the stuff where we decided to use PSR instead of Symfony. And so Symfony's HTTP foundation is not immutable. So it has one request object and one response object. And you can add a lot of hooks to do stuff with the request and response object. And the PSR-7 thing came from another group and thought that would be cooler. So it's kind of a dispute how things work. Then one other thing we don't use is PSR-6 and 16. PSR-6 was like, yeah, let's make this caching stuff interoperable. So we could use a different caching API. And for instance, Symfony is using that. PSR-6 was really complicated because it was like, put that into the cache. Oh, you can only put that into a cache if it's an object of cache item. Okay, so it's a cache item with a string. Turned out to be very complex, and you have to create a lot of objects. So the folks there came up with a simple cache, which is similar to what we are doing, but not the same. So enough about all the other things. Let's talk about event dispatching. That's why you're here, I guess. And I read somewhere that 2015, then somebody was doing stuff with event dispatching in this PSR stuff. And I don't know about this microphone. This group kind of like, we should standardize that, and then everybody was busy and nothing happened. And then I talked to a person, and this person was like, yeah, I'm busy, but it would be cool to revive that. And at that time, I was looking for better ways to get rid of hooks and signals in TYPO3 and just have one better way. Maybe it's just actually, maybe the signal slot is the way to go, then it should get out of XBase and into core, but we'll have, I basically analyzed all the hooks that we have and see what kind of different types we have, and came up with, I think, 3 approaches for TYPO3 core to do that, and I never felt 100% comfortable because I never was sure, should we use the Symfony event dispatcher stuff? It's kind of okay-ish, I don't know. And at some point, and that was 2018, I asked again, and basically we formed a small group of people, I think 6 people. I'll talk about that later. And the first job I had was to evaluate all the existing implementations out there. And there are event dispatchers. Why should we create another one for TYPO3? I did that anyways. So we have Symfony event dispatcher, which is nice. Then from the PHP League, there's the event package. Doctrine has an event manager themselves. They extracted that. And Laravel, of course, has their own. And then all the CMSs, for instance, or other systems, there's so many systems that have hooks. Drupal has hooks, and then they integrated Symfony in Drupal 8, and then they had events, and then now they have both. We have hooks and signals, and a lot of different types of hooks. WordPress has these hooks, I don't know. And Magento 2 has this weird AOP magic where you can say, wrap that around the other method or before or just after a new code gets generated. So that sounds cool, but a little bit overdose. And if you look at Composer, Composer also has a plugin system, which is also similar to all the other frameworks, but not the same. Well, event dispatching is really important, not just for us in the TYPO3 world, but basically every PHP package you create that is public, and you want people not just to use it, but also to extend it on their own, needs some kind of event mechanism. Because with these events, you don't have to touch the author's code to extend it. Well, you can, of course, let's take news. Where's Georg? We love news, right? So every time I want to have an additional field in news, I would tell Georg, please add this field because my news also has a phone number, whatever. And then you extend it and you extend it, and all of a sudden news is really fat because there's one person needed this and the other needed that. And the cool thing with events is just tell Georg, create an event or a hook, and you have it. We all know that. But I mentioned the different types of events. And some people hear events and they think about event sourcing, and we're not talking about that. But we're talking about events as in hooks. And there are a couple of ones, and we try to formulate that. And once the event in a one-way notification, it's like, yeah, I just wrote something in the database, just wanted to let you know. And the other thing is that you tell, well, I'm going to write something into the database. maybe you want to modify something. You know, when I say, hey, I just did something, you can't change the past, but with the object enhancement idea is that I'm going to write something to the database. Maybe, hey, grid elements, you want to move some call posts around? Do that. So that's the kind of object enhancement we had in mind. The events for collection is, give me all your things, maybe I will do something with that. It's like, hey, I'm going to render this menu. This module menu in the backend. Here I am. Give me all your menu items. Maybe I'll do something with it. So you're calling everybody up, and then there's the alternative chain, which I would say is similar to, hey, I'm going to log in, and I'm usually going to use username and password. Maybe you want to check against Active Directory, then go your way, and I won't do my thing by default. And again, event sourcing is not scope. So going a bit deeper in this whole event dispatcher thing, we came up with, who's responsible for what, and we try to find the right names, because if you come up with a standard, you need to define what you're talking about actually. And so there's this listener, there's a caller, or whatever you want to name it, and I figure it's quite difficult to understand that. So an event is actually something happens. And previously we had, if you think about hooks in our case, an event is that somebody's creating an object or an array with call by reference, so you kind of could figure that you could change it. It has some identifier, in our case this SC options class T3lib, whatever, back from 2004. Others use constants in final classes. I think Doctrine does that. And Doctrine also has event arcs, but in general, we're usually talking about an event. Then we have a listener, and that's us as extension authors. We want to modify something, and we're just listening. Hey, there's going to be an event. We can do it. Somebody call it observers or subscribers. And the listener just could say, oh, you just added something to the database? I'll remember that, and in 2 years, I'll send you an email. So you can do that. And then we figured, how do you connect the listener and to the events? So we have something we call listener provider, where we just collect all the listeners so we know that they're there. And then we have the so-called event dispatcher, which we put into the main code to say, at this point, we're going to do something. And maybe we want to do something with the results. That's what we call also the emitter code, caller's code. Maybe I added something to an event, like I'm going to add something to the database fields before I insert that. Maybe I want to do that. In some other case, I just want to say I did something. I don't care about the results. So the question is, what's there to standardize? And it's all about sharing. The cool thing, I was like, okay, I'll write my own PSR-14 implementation. I did that. It's not a big deal. It's like 100 lines of code. But actually, I would like to write code so it's not dependent on my Benni library, event dispatcher library. I called mine cart. And that it does not matter, because maybe mine has some PHP 7.4 cool features, and the other things are faster because they did some ugly caching, so that's also possible. And everybody should be choosing the right tool for whatever they want to do. And for TYPO3, I wrote also another event dispatcher implementation of PSR-14. And by the time it got integrated, that was 2 weeks ago. And I did that in February. We had this dependency injection. And with the dependency injection, I could have used something completely different from PSR-14, and I didn't do that because event dispatching just wires everything together. A great example is that TYPO3 core ships with, I talked about this PSR-7 request response stuff. TYPO3 core ships with Core's PSR-7 implementation request response. And we use Guzzle. Guzzle brings their own PSR-7 request response. And something else as well. I can't remember. We have 3 implementations in TYPO3 core that we ship. And it's the same code, basically. They just use different interfaces. They use the same interfaces. And now with dependency injection, we get rid of our own code, which is great. So we don't have to maintain it. I love the sharing part. So these are different ways how people did event dispatching. It looks similar to signal slot stuff. That's how they did it in previous projects, and it's the good example why we should standardize it, because it's all similar, but it's not the same. So the difficult part is we shouldn't standardize everything. We should not worry about WordPress and PHP 5.2. And we should, that's the difficult part about PHP-FIG, that because either you standardize, and standardizing means we're just going back to what's the same thing. But maybe we should also look into the future, what might make sense in the future. So that's usually a heavy dispute between Symfony and PHP-FIG, if you read Twitter and all the ugly things on Reddit. Because Symfony's event dispatcher is based, I would say, on PHP 5.3. And it's very, very simple. And they said, we have this huge backwards compatibility promise. We don't want to change that. And that's why it's kept in a way that it's just like that, because then nothing breaks. And most of Symfony stuff is hooking into these event dispatcher things, so we won't change that. So you take our implementation, and that's the way to go. We might make some tweaks, but that's it. So that was difficult. And of course, Laravel is out of the game. They don't really care that much about PHP-FIG and interoperability. And that's why we have a lot of dispute in this working group about finding, the most common ground, but also something that makes sense in the future that we can use with PHP 7. So we said, okay. So we met every week with 6 people to figure something out for 1 hour. And by the end, we had like 100 pages of documentation on what we discussed. And we came up with the idea that an event, previously we have this SC options, blah, 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 in TYPO3. Symfony has these strings. Doctrine does the constant stuff, which is also strings. Symfony does that also. And we decided we're just going to use the class name of a PHP object, which also means we're dealing with objects. Dealing with objects is nice because you exactly know what you're allowed to do and what you can't do. Then we also we looked into the possibility to have immutable events. You can't change this event, and that's not possible in PHP. So that's something we have to write down to make sure this happens. And we also figured the whole registration process. That's probably one of the most interesting parts for you. It's like, how do you determine who's first and who's last of the listeners? I want to have a listener after PowerMail. And I had a lot of hooks in real URL just before or just after real URL to do stuff. And that's when I think, I give you an example. One library says we'll have something we call priority. You can say I'm first, so you have the number 0, and I don't care, I'm last, I'm number 100. The other framework does it the exact opposite way. That 100 is the highest number, so you're first, 0 is nothing. So what do? And if if two listeners sign up for number 0, what does that mean? So we just quickly found out if we want to standardize that, that's not going to happen. So that's something framework should solve. And we have this dependency ordering service in TYPO3. We can do a lot of things with that. We use that in the middlewares in TYPO 3.9. So we just use that, but it's not part of the standard. So the standard has a long document, but also 3 PHP interfaces, which I want to show you because they're very, very simple. It's an interface, event dispatcher interface, and it receives an object, and that's only possible, I think, with PHP 7.2. And that's the reason why the interface, if we leave out the object, the event could be a string again. Oh, then it would be compatible with a lot of other solutions. However, if it's not an object, maybe the function should be called, or the method should be called dispatch me or dispatch until or whatever. So you'll never find something. So we came up with dispatch, and because that's what it does, it dispatches an event. But also, if it's an object, then people are like, objects are so expensive in memory. In PHP 7, it's not, and that's why we did that. Then we have this listener provider. So let's see. The event dispatcher, what will that one do? It just loops over the listeners and says, hey, I did. Here's an event, do something with it, or not. And that's something I think is a fairly simple code, and we only need it once. The listener provider is the one that, in our case, the listener provider, we have one listener provider who loops through all TYPO3 extensions and looks for listeners. And that's something that's specific to TYPO3, and that's what every framework has to write on its own. And you can say, give me all listeners that are compatible with TYPO3, or you can create multiple listeners and lazy listener loaders and providers. It's very flexible. You just need to return an iterable, basically an array, but in a better way, memory saving way, let's put it this way. And yeah, the providers can do a lot of magic. So I created a Composer plugin. If you do Composer install and you use Composer, it calculates all the listener providers on at that time, which is nice because if you clear caches, it's still going to be the same. But if you add a new listener, you have to write Composer, create listeners. So you can do a lot of things. And that was one of my proof of concepts if we see that that works. And for TYPO3, it would be super cool to have a listener provider for all the TYPO3 extensions, but also something for all the doctrine events which you want to sign up for. So you could create some aggregate provider. And the event object, there is no event object standardized because an object is an object and it could be anything. So I created an example. I called it my template name modifier event. And this class, it's final because I like final events. There's nothing to change from that side. And it just receives a template name, and we have a get template name, and we have a set template name. So one listener could just see, oh, if it's template name XYZ, do something, and the other could actually override it. So we have no interface for the event because, go ahead. That's my example. I'm sorry. Good point. Ollie is the person with the details on this kind of stuff, which is great. Really. Yeah, so that's a mistake in my presentation. However, why is there no interface? That's actually what I wanted to say. You have an so I didn't know how to actually say this, but you know the singleton interface? Singleton interface does not have any methods or whatever things that you have to implement. And that's what people in computer science apparently call marker interface. Just learn something. So a marker interface just marks something as I'm a singleton. And we could do the same with an event interface. But because we have the object, the type hint object, type hint is correct. Type declaration, yeah. Type declaration object. Then the additional interface is not necessary. We don't need it because an event could be anything.
But with an interface, you would be more specific. So in this case, I can hand in a standard class, a new standard class, and add it, and it would be used. And I can't be sure that it's really implementing what is needed.
Yeah, that is correct. I'll go one step further in a second. Because how does a listener know that how I want to do something with this event? Well, first, that's how we do it. You create a new event. You can use new because it's a final and whatever you want to do. You can use make instance if you love it. And then you write home HTML. And the specification says that you have to return an event object. It's not in the interface, but it's in the specification that the same event has to be returned, the same object. And if you don't do this in your implementation, you're doing it wrong. And the event result, you can just call get template name, and maybe it was changed or maybe it wasn't, but you just deal with objects instead of dumping in the template name and modifying it. So the thing you are most interested in are listeners. So I created a listener to do something with this template name. And you listeners can also be anything. Functions, if you love WordPress, methods. It should be, I think it should be serializable, but not necessarily. And the only thing you can do, you can just write a class with invoke, which I like to do. But in this case, we have a method called late night template. You can name it whatever you want, no interface, whatever. And the only thing you have is the first argument. And the first and only argument is the event type declaration for a specific event. So if you have this specific event, you TYPO3 or the provider chooses the right one for you. So the event dispatcher just loops, hey, give me all listeners who fit for this event, my template name modifier event, and listener provider says, oh, that one matches, because it does. Maybe you can do this on runtime to check for first argument and do annotation, reflection, thanks, to find out if that's the right one. But there's so many other ways to do that. It's not related to what we're doing. So that was the basic concept actually already, except for one thing, the stoppable event interface, because right now all of these interfaces and objects you've seen are unstoppable. That's what I like to say. And a stoppable event is something that one listener could say, yeah, I actually overrode the template name and that's fine. Nobody else needs to do anything because I've already done the job. It's like sending out a notification, or I had no, it's not sending out a recommendation. The example previously was the login thing. I've already logged in, no problem. You don't need to authenticate. So then your event is actually implementing the stoppable event interface, and in TYPO3 core, I would check, oh, it was stopped. This propagation stopped, then I won't do my default authentication. Well, a lot of I'm lazy and I'm egoistic. The reason why I did that as a PHP project author was I would like to use one event dispatcher, and not just because of hooks and signal slot, but also because of somebody else could actually, or I can finally use Doctrine implementation once Doctrine implements PSR-14. But also, my extensions could hook into Symfony components in the same way as TYPO3 does it. And it's really nice because all the events are event objects, and we can easily identify them. Maybe we'll use an interface for identifying them, but also maybe just through a proper folder structure. And an object can be documented and or use type declarations to find out what should be there. And old hooks could be migrated to listeners. And I've actually done that for the whole core extension. And it was too much work, so I just got in PSR-14, and then we can migrate once at a time. And basically, a hook is just, oh, there's a new event. We'll just use, we're going to call the first listener. Oh, the first listener doesn't do anything except for each globals, blah, blah, blah. And that's a hook. So we can migrate to that. I really like that, if we want to do that. Yeah, for me as a coder, I know what I can change. I love that. Otherwise, I had this P object or parent object in TYPO3 hooks, and I could do so much with it, but I don't know if that was intended by Casper 15 years ago. Now we can define what is intended and extend that if we want to enrich the feature set. And it's cool because it's hopefully the same concepts. Then if you do Swool or any other wild PHP things like async PHP stuff, you could use the same concept. In addition, you also have the blog series. So from Larry, who also was part of the working group, who was the editor, who wrote everything down. That's really cool stuff. And yeah, that's basically everything for the PSR stuff. So now I said it's two parts. I want to show you. The other part is very quick. I have to just get rid of that. The cool thing was that I was part of that. I could make sure that everything we needed was covered in the PSR. I like that too. I hope you see the screen. So we have that's the wrong one. Here we go. So the mailer hopefully had a signal slot, and now I will make that a bit larger. Happen, presentation, whatever. That's really difficult for me. Yeah, I have to go this way because I haven't mirrored presentation mode. So version 10 looks very easy because it just calls get event dispatcher dispatch and creates a new event. And this event doesn't care about what you want to do with it afterwards. It was just I initialize something, I'll hand over myself, and you can do something with me after I've done my So that's one part. We're interested in the part where you actually register this stuff. And that's the part where we register something. And we basically create in our own extension a services YAML because we want to do that anyways in version 10. And you just list, you can do the same in PHP, by the way. Back to presentation mode. We now just say we have this class post initialize mailer compatibility slot because it was a single slot before. And I want to tag it for event. It's an event listener. We can give it an identifier. With an identifier, we can say, I want to be run before or after another identifier. And I want to be connected to this event. And that's it. Then you clear the caches, and you can get into this single file I will show you now. And that's the last slide. Well, the post initialize mailer, which is a listener, calls the signal slot dispatcher, xSpace, and just calls the string. We've heard about the string, the class, calls signal slot dispatcher, and that's it. So in this way, we can almost all of our hooks and signal slots can be built through event dispatching. And actually, because Symfony 5 will have the same event dispatcher as we have, we could get rid of our package and just provide this connector for loading this stuff. And we don't have to write our own code anymore. Yeah. So we don't have any time. Maybe one question, if there's one. No? Then thanks for listening.